Hello everyone, this is Chromý and together we will continue the course Interdisciplinary Approaches to Language and its Use too. In this presentation we will end our discussion of language variation and we will focus on the birth and death of language varieties. In the previous presentation we introduced the model of language change as a consequence of communication accommodation by Peter Auer and Franz Hinskens. We discussed the possibility that accommodation in certain situations may lead to long-term accommodation and that this may lead to a language change on the community level. One possible result of this process is that a certain variety ceases to exist. There are many examples for this from different areas. One of the key causes of the death of a certain variety is language contact. An interesting study from this point of view is the paper by Nathalie Schilling-Estes and Wolfram, Alternative Models of Dialect Death, Dissipation versus Concentration. According to this study, the key role of the process of dialect death is played by attitudes. Schilling-Estes and Wolfram argue that the speakers of minority varieties must be rather endocentric to maintain their variety, which means that they must be focused primarily on the inner community norms and not on the majority norms. They must view their own variety as something valuable and tightly connected with their culture. In relation to this, the authors distinguish two types of variety death. The first is dissipation, which is the process when the features specific to the given variety slowly cease to be used and are substituted by the features of the majority variety. The variety thus ceases to exist because all the differences between this variety and the majority one are lost. The second process is the so-called concentration. Schilling-Estes and Wolfram argue that this is the process when the variety is not really losing its differences, but it is losing its speakers. Concentration is thus a process when a dialect does not die due to language contact, but a process when the dialect is maintained, but the community using it is actually dying out. To illustrate the process of dialect death, we can have a look on this plot which captures the knowledge of words from a traditional Norfolk dialect by the speakers from Norfolk in eastern England. The tested words were picked from the dialectological lexicon from the 19th century. We can see that the speakers from the old and middle-aged generation exhibited a rather good knowledge of the Norfolk dialect words. The speakers between 18 and 30 years did recognize only around 30% of words, and the younger ones even less. This is a rapid process, but quite typical for many dialects. The contact between the varieties does not only cause the death of some of the varieties, but it can also lead to the birth of new ones. The death of a certain variety does not necessarily mean an adoption of a supralocal standard. David Britton, in his study One Foot in the Grave, Dialect Death, Dialect Contact and Dialect Birth in England, discusses four sources for the birth of a new variety. First is the geolinguistic diffusion, thanks to which the features from other regions are used in the new variety. The second is the intra-regional colonization. This is the situation when a supraregional standard is formed in some area. Britton mentions examples of interdialects which contain features which were not actually present in any of the original dialects. The third source is ethnic variation. Britton discusses the examples of the influence of ethnolects on language of white population, especially on adolescents. Fourth source is the contact of local dialects, which may happen in specific situations when speakers of different dialects gather in a certain area, such as when a new city is found, and so on. An example of the situation when speakers from different dialectal areas gather in a certain area may be the Czech borderlands. After the expulsion of the German-speaking inhabitants after the Second World War, Czech borderlands started to be colonized by people from different areas of Czechoslovakia. An interesting study on the formation of a new variety is the paper by Pavel Yanczyk, Mluva v západočeském pohraničí. It analyzes survey data from 1964 and then interview data from the 1970s. In his study, Pavel Yanczyk found that the speech of younger generation in the time of the research showed certain common typical features. Altogether, it was a Bohemian interdialect which contained certain local features, mostly borrowed from the southwestern Bohemian variety. Also, Yanczyk found that many previous dialectal features which were present in the speech of the first generation of the immigrants was not transferred to the speech of the second generation. Last but not least, Yanczyk found that there were inner differences in the area under examination and that it was dependent on the regional closeness to the Bohemian varieties. Before we will conclude this presentation, I have one reading tip for you, and this is a study, Creating a New Town Koine, Children and Language Change in Milton Keynes by Paul Kerswell and Anne Williams. Milton Keynes is a city which was founded in the 1960s, and it is thus very interesting from the dialect context perspective. If you enjoyed the presentations, we would be glad if you would like them on YouTube. That is all from me now. And also, this is the end of the language variation part of the course. I hope you liked it, and I hope at least some of you will go further and become experts in the whole field. Goodbye.